Broadcasting from the campus of Salisbury University, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7, putting Delmarva first. It's time for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
After 28 years, Delegate Norm Conway will no longer serve in Annapolis. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. For many on the Eastern Shore, it was a stunning loss. In the midterm elections, he was defeated by Republican Carl Anderton by a margin of 53% to 47%. He's been a key figure in Annapolis as chair of the House Appropriations Committee since 2003. Conway is being replaced in that position by Maggie McIntosh from Baltimore. Before that, he served on the Salisbury City Council, becoming president, and before that, he was a teacher and vice principal. So we decided to invite the delegate on the program, not only to comment on the politics of the moment, but also wanted to take a look back at the history, because you've been there a long time, seen a number of governors come and go, and so we wanted to get that sense as well. But first of all, I guess the question that a lot of people had was, what happened? What do you think?
Well, I think there were a combination of things. I think there was a lot of concern raised about taxes, and nobody wants to pay taxes. Sometimes I don't either. But they become the budget for democracy, and the interactions of government, the way government works, and how you have to pay for it. I think also there was some strong concern about Governor O'Malley. Not a good feeling on the shore about him. And I think the other thing, turnout. Voter turnout was really disappointing. And I guess some will tell me that the change in the district, the change from a two-member district to a single-member district, and that probably had some impact also. I worked regardless, like I was still in the 38th total, because that's where I started back in '87. I had all three counties, and I think have been able to work with everyone, build bridges, and get to know delegations, get to know members, and work accordingly. And I think that's what has been saving grace in many instances for many things that we needed on the shore, that you could go to others and ask for their help, and you basically got it.
I'm going to ask you, by the way, because one of the things that just struck me was that you were chair of the Appropriations Committee, and that's a key position in the state legislature. Have we lost something because we don't have someone who is particularly in that position? I mean, I know that McIntosh, I guess, has been appointed and comes from actually from Baltimore. Are we going to get as much attention, do you think, in terms of the Eastern Shore, in terms of the state legislature?
Well, everyone seems to think, that a change in those positions. All I can tell you is that when Speaker Cass Taylor lost out in Western Maryland, not as much attention got focused on Western Maryland. And the fact that he was the speaker, many said Western Maryland will never have another speaker. The urban counties will basically take care of that. And I think I've had people tell me the same thing about the chairmanship of the Appropriations Committee. It's key. We have actually had three members from the Eastern Shore who have been in the past. John Hargraves was the first chairman of Appropriations as such, as a committee, and then followed by Clayton Mitchell from the Upper Shore. And Clay was speaker when I came in '87. And then at the death of Pete Rawlings in 2003, I became chairman of Appropriations. If you do not have that individual, and I noticed in a couple of things this morning that I read, Baltimore City is being tooted already because of Maggie's appointment. I think Maggie would be a very fair person, but that doesn't always work out in how things get done. So I think we will. I think we'll have some impact, and we'll feel that. I always looked at the capital budget as a jobs budget, and during this downturn of the economy, if you go back and look, we've had a lot of building on the Eastern Shore, and we tried to focus toward that so that construction jobs, which were hard to come by, became still a major part for the Eastern Shore, with Salisbury University building, with UMES, with Highways 113, and Warwick Community College. A number of their buildings have been built during this period. School construction in all the Eastern Shore counties. Really, we've gotten more than our share. But we had some greater needs also. So tried to make sure that they got taken care of.
Now, one of the things that struck me about the election night was the Republicans did very well. I mean, obviously not only nationally, but they did very well here on the Eastern Shore. I mean, you had your own loss, but Jim Mathias now stands out as one of the few Democrats who are still in the state legislature from this area. As the Eastern Shore changed, are we seeing what could be a permanent Republican dominance of the Eastern Shore, particularly on the delegate side or the state Senate side? I mean, how do you read those tea leaves?
Well, I think if you look at the Eastern Shore delegation over the past, I'd say 3 terms, we have moved from a democratically controlled Eastern Shore delegation to a Republican-controlled delegation. That reflects tendencies on the shore and in each of the counties. Definitely a change politically. Does it mean forever? No, I don't think so. I still believe that the type of candidates and people themselves will still be the focus point and how well they carry out. I think with Senator Mathias, he had a tough campaign. He had to raise a lot of money, had to spend a lot of money, but I think also he still had the entirety of District 38, which was an advantage for him. I moved from a 2-member district to a single-member district, and I do think that made a difference.
So, looking ahead in terms of the state, we're facing some serious deficits. Looks like maybe $300 million this year, $600 million next year. And yet there's a lot of discussion about cutting taxes. I know that the incoming Republican-elect governor, Larry Hogan, has talked about still wanting to cut taxes, and obviously that's going to mean cutting spending. How do you read the themes? Can one cut taxes and still deal with this deficit, or how do you read that?
No, I don't think you do, and I think the new governor has already said in this first year and maybe the second year that he's not going to be able to do the cuts that maybe he would like to in certain ways for taxes. I think that goes back to the last couple of years of Glendenning, when a 10% personal income tax reduction was given, and over a 2-year period, no one even knew they got it, but it cost revenues over $1 billion, and we never recouped from that, and followed up with a Thornton plan for education funding. Those two in combination helped put us in the position we were in over this last 5 or 6 years, because you cut so much in the way of revenue and still try to maintain programs existing and so forth.
Because it does seem to me that you were right, that you were dealing with when I came in particular, you were dealing with a structural deficit, which I think is what you've outlined.
Yes.
And then in about 2008, 2009, you're hit with a Great Recession, which puts even more pressure on it. So it sounds like where all of this is now the result of that. Do you have any sense about why we're looking at deficits now that perhaps we might not in the future? I mean, is this a temporary thing? Some people, for instance, have suggested there's a Medicaid issue, for example. How do you read it?
Medicaid is a significant factor, and the federal government and our reliance on federal jobs and federal agencies that are in Maryland. We've touted that, as being a positive. But there are times when you come up to sequestration that the federal government's getting into now, that could really impact. It impacted Virginia tremendously. In fact, they just got their budget solved maybe a month ago. They've been fighting a significant, over $2 billion, as I understood, that they were dealing with, trying to get it solved. So I think our reliance, it's nice to have the federal institutions and agencies in our state because of the employees and the spending that they do. But you also cannot let that become your baseline for everything else. That's why we need to really go after economic development in all regions of our state, so that somewhere in every region of the state, we've got a place for a corporation or businesses, and that ultimately builds that underlying structure that's needed to carry on during tough times.
How much is the business climate in terms of regulations relevant to what we're seeing? I mean, I know during the campaign there's a lot of discussion about that we're not friendly to business in terms of Maryland business regulations, and that's one of the reasons why we're not seeing that growth.
Well, I think if you go back, and I've looked at this, my gosh, I don't know how many times, trying to come up with some ways that we might be able to modify to some degree that perception of a poor business climate. And, I think the National Chamber of Commerce has something like 10 or 12 different factors. Really, Maryland does very well with most of those factors. The taxes and the regulatory aspects are the two areas that we really do need to work on. The regulatory process, I could tell you could ask 5 or 6 of the secretaries how many times they've come into my office to talk with me about regulations and the impact that it has. Even in our own area, Chesapeake Shipbuilding had one heck of a time with regulations. And here they were expanding, and we were looking at the potential of another 125 new jobs. And we needed to get it modified to some degree and to be reasonable. I think many of the businesses feel that the regulatory process in Maryland is just not reasonable. And when you listen to what their complaints are, the kinds of things that have occurred with those representing the agencies coming in to see them, you can understand how they got the feeling. And that's what I've tried to relay to the secretaries. I understand that as the secretary, you give certain directives. But there's an area down there, Midway or somewhere, where people have been there a long time. They don't like to do things differently, and you may have to do a little more pushing than you want to. But that's important. And I think the other thing is the taxes. I think when we look at Virginia, we look at West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Delaware, I think we need to modify our tax structure. We're not way out of line, but we're enough out of line that it makes a difference. And people see that. And I'd like to see us modify so that we're more in sync with the states around us in most of those areas. Any
particular tax source that you think we should be looking at that maybe that should be changed a little?
Well, I think income taxes, and I think certainly corporation taxes, and we're on the Eastern Shore. We have about 5 counties that join Delaware, And of course, they always talk about the tax-free state. Not really, because they do have a tax that they put on. You just don't see it, and they don't tell you about it. But I think those are the kinds of things that we really ought to look at and address. That was something that I felt very strongly about, and we talked about it last year, and how we might be able to move toward that. Now it'll be someone else's turn to take a look at it.
Speaking of regulations, we've had the phosphorus management tool, which has been a very strong controversy over it. Governor O'Malley says that he's moving ahead with it. And we have Larry Hogan, the governor-elect, saying that it's very critical of it. What's the future of that regulation that basically attempts to reduce phosphorus at the agricultural level? I mean, are we looking at something that's going to be stillborn? I know that Senator Mathias has talked about opposing it, strongly opposing it. What future do you see for that particular regulation?
I strongly opposed it also.
Yeah,
in fact, I so strongly opposed it, I put a bill in that required the economic impact study, which kind of threw everything off the table at that point. And I got criticized, by the environmentalists for setting a precedent for an economic impact study. And I didn't feel that. And I said to them that basically I feel it's very, very important. This is our number one industry in the state. Poultry industry is number one on Delmarva Peninsula, not just affecting Maryland, but Delaware and Eastern Shore of Virginia as well. And I think we have to be aware of what kind of impacts we're creating when we do these things. The second thing is that you had conflicting stories about what science said about phosphorus and its movement and so forth. And I think I told the environmental groups at that time, and the agricultural groups too, I think it's time that they get together. They get at a table, they sit down, everybody starts talking about where their differences are. This thing of standing off and bashing each other all the time, I don't see how you could look at the farming community and say that they're not environmental conscious when their economic life depends on their production. And if you were not environmentally concerned, that production would be going down. It would not be going up. So those are things that I think we ought to really key in on and sit down and have a good, reliable discussion about what the issues are and how we can meet them. I think this regulation should not go. I think I have an appointment with the governor. I know he's bent on doing it. I'm going to tell him why he shouldn't. So
one last piece of advice there.
One last piece. I'm there till January 14th, I think, until noon.
Do you think we've come far enough in terms of cleaning up the bay? I mean, are there things that we should be doing that maybe we're not doing overall?
Well, I think there have been some positive steps taken, and I used to criticize all the time because Maryland was putting so much money into the bay cleanup, and yet the reports that came out every year didn't give us that great of a mark. And I felt very strongly that we needed to, at the federal level and EPA, instead of just focusing on Maryland all the time, they need to talk to those states to the north where their tributaries come into the Susquehanna, come down to the dam and into the bay. And I watched that satellite pictures of that plume that came down the Chesapeake Bay after the storm. And it really pointed out to you how critical those states to the north play on the cleanup of the bay as well. Now, EPA's taken some steps in that direction, and I just hope they recognize how important that is also, because Chesapeake Bay, it's in Maryland, but it's a significant waterway, and water for the nation as well. And I think we need to do everything we can to maintain it. I'd like to see oysters at the level of the 1900. That would be great, and because they too help clean the bay, and that's very important. Our shellfish, our fisheries, and very, very important to the watermen, very important to the state overall as a resource. So,
let me ask you this. I want to take you back. So, 28 years you've been. What was the East when you went to Annapolis? What was the state like, and what was the Eastern Shore like, and how does it differ from where we are now?
Well, I think just from people and development. I mean, I was born and raised in Salisbury, so I remember.
You've seen it all, right?
I remember when everything occurred on Friday nights on Main Street.
Right.
That was downtown Salisbury, and congregations of people on the street, lively shopping on the stores that were a part of Main Street. All of that has changed. I mean, we started getting the malls. We started getting really a development of the crossroads of Delmarva with 50 and 13. And we have seen tourism become a much more important factor of the Delmarva Peninsula for our beaches. Ocean City and then Fenwick and Bethany and Rehoboth, all very, very important. Revenue sources for the state as well, for Delaware and for Maryland. 28 years ago, my big thing was funding of education, because I didn't feel that the rural areas got a fair shake. And it took a while, but we finally got to the Thornton formula, and that kind of evened it out. It avoided probably a major suit that would have been filed by Baltimore City, and Somerset County would have joined that. I think we worked very hard to take a look at everything, and not just equity in funding, but adequacy of funding, depending on the counties and their populations and the kids that they serve.
How do you compare the politicians back then as opposed to now?
Far less partisan, and I think that's one of the things that everybody ought to step back and take a good look at, and feeling of how we could do a much better job for the state and for the nation, to be able to once again really give focus to the word compromise, and be able to sit down with people and talk one-on-one. To me, that's critically important, and it's a component that we have lost over the years. For some reason, we got to a point of thinking party situations were far greater than serving the national interest. And I think that has peeled off, not just at the national level, but into states as well. And that's a shame.
We've had like three, I guess this will be the second Republican governor since Spiro Agnew. How do you assess the role of Republican governors and the Republican Party in the state? I mean, and particularly, how do you assess the heritage of somebody like Bob Ehrlich?
Well, Bob Ehrlich went to the legislature with me in 1987. I mean, he was a part of the group that went at that time. I worked a couple of bills with him on the floor, and very friendly individual. Something happened when he left the legislature and went to Washington, and when he came back, there was a difference. That's not just my perception; that was the perception of a lot of people. I think when he first went in as governor, he wanted to kind of pull back on some of those perceptions that had been there. He was never able to do it for whatever reasons. Many people in Annapolis kind of thought it was the people he brought back with him that really influenced his administration in such a way that the real Bob Ehrlich never came back.
And how about Paris Glendenning? And how do you compare him to say Martin O'Malley, for example? Because one of the things that struck me as I've talked to people here is that a lot of the folks, particularly in the agricultural sector, really attribute Glendenning to this idea of really sort of imposing regulations on the farmer. When Bob Ehrlich came along, there's emphasis on, for instance, on voluntarily complying. I'm not sure where we are with O'Malley now, but how do you compare that? Was he really the beginning of this thing that was going on?
Well,
because a lot of farmers will cite him, particularly.
I think the one thing that doesn't get brought into the picture is the role of the federal government and EPA, the mandates that they have given to the state. You have certain governors that have paid more attention to those mandates and concern over what impact it may have on federal funding to the state, and they were counting on that quite a bit. But then you'll have, we look at that in Maryland. We've pretty much jumped every time EPA had something that they wanted to send out. I was not one of those who felt we ought to jump. I felt very much like how Delaware, basically, they listened to what the EPA had to say, but in the end, they did what they felt was best for Delaware. I know they don't have the Chesapeake Bay, and that becomes a qualifying factor. But at the same time, I think Governor Glendenning did put a lot of emphasis on the Bay and on environmental issues, and his actions reflected that. Ehrlich was a little different in where he wanted to put the focus as far as impact, and I think O'Malley has picked that up again, and basically at times, when we had the Hudson situation, he did call the university to task for the actions that they had taken in University Law School in Baltimore. He put it in words, which, I appreciated a great deal because I thought they were way off base also, and told them so. Gave a little more focus to it through budget, but
right, that always catches somebody's attention, doesn't it?
that always gets attention. But I think it's the impact and the perception that governors take to where they want their administration to be seen by the people of the state overall. And sometimes they don't always get the perception back to them that's out here. And I think the regulatory process and the focus that's given to that by most of the agencies in the state now create a bad image and taste for the people of Maryland who have to deal with it.
By the way, how do you assess the rise of the Tea Party since 2010, and what kind of impact do you think it's had here on the shore, particularly on your Republican colleagues?
Well, I think they basically they do reflect what you hear about the Tea Party members and so forth. I guess what they started as, the "don't tread on me" situation. When you have a nation developed like the United States, and the individual states and all of them trying to maintain certain rights and so forth that they want to hold on to, inevitably you're going to have people who are going to take certainly differences with you. I'm not sure that it's as implanted as sometimes people think, and certain individuals will certainly give hype to it, and others will say different things. Well, I believe this, but And I find that quite a bit. We have, I think, probably the largest Tea Party group is in northern Worcester. And many of those folks are people who have moved here and have certain perceptions about government. Interestingly, many of them have worked for government. And that always intrigues me, that you develop some perceptions and so forth, and yet your career was working for the federal government or state government or whatever, and something begins to change or nudge you or whatever. You don't want to pay as much in taxes and so forth. I understand that. And I tell people every now and then too, I pay taxes too, but I do want a quality of life for what I've spent and what I pay for. And I don't always agree with everything that's been done, but I don't know of any other place I want to live.
So speaking of that, so what's next for you?
Well, when one door closes, everybody's told me another one opens. And
has that door open yet?
Well, it may have, because retirement is out there. You can certainly think of that as another avenue, and one that I have never really embraced yet.
You're gonna miss Annapolis?
Yeah, I will.
Yeah.
And yet I've had 28 great years up there. I've been an Eastern Shoreman. I've served in a number of capacities of leadership, and due to the speakers, from Clay Mitchell to Cass Taylor to Mike Bush. They've all given me some great opportunities and some great roles to play, and I've appreciated that. And I've certainly tried to make sure that our region has gotten its fair share.
We've been speaking with Delegate Norm Conway. He is leaving Annapolis after this session, and we appreciate you stopping by and talking with us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
This has been Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Chris Rank produces and is our audio engineer. Don Rush is your host. For podcasts, visit our website, delmarvapublicradio.net, or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast in iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on PAC 14. To view the schedule, visit the Daily Times or visit pac14.org.